get any. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now we got it. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well then, welcome and thank you everybody for joining us. As many of you know, this event is organized by the CLEA Research Group. I'm aware some of you may already know the group, but CLEA stands for Cognition, Language, Enactivism, and Affectivity. The group was founded in May of 2020 with the purpose of uniting researchers from different places around related themes and interests. And despite contemplating a wide spectrum of theoretical positions and inclinations, the group assumes that cognitive, linguistic, and affective processes cannot be understood outside the agent's situated activities in his or her physical and social environment. So you can find us on the X Twitter under the name CleaFew. I'll ask Felipe to please write the address in the chat while I talk. And so please follow us there so you can know about the future events like these, as well as the group's activities. So if you want to know more about the group, you're also welcome to visit our website at the address sites.google.com/view/CleaFew. It is also on the chat right now. Well, considering the growing interest in activist approaches, we're launching a series of events called The Future of Enactivism. Our aim is to gather researchers interested in discussing the possibilities, the challenges, and the future directions of enactivism as a research program. So questions like, where is it headed? What are its key issues and how we can handle them? And of course, if we can. So, in order to help us tackle with these questions today, we're glad to have with us Russell Meyer and Guilherme Sanches de Oliveira. Russell Meyer is a philosopher of science working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Philosophy at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. So if you're in Brazil and you're wondering why you had to wake up so early, his time zone is to blame, but I'm sure it's going to be worth it. His recent work revolves around the nature of role and scientific explanations in sciences, such as psychology and biology. Today, he's going to present us his view on enactivism, which involves, among other things, the distinction between utopian and scientific enactivism. Now, Guilherme Sanches de Oliveira, from the Technische Universität Berlin, is a philosopher in cognitive science engaged in both theoretical and experimental research in embodied cognitive science. He's a member of the Embody Research Group and is particularly interested in the implications of embodiment for how we make sense of higher cognition and technologically supported problem solving. Today, he's here to comment and debate the presented view on enactivism. So this is how it's going to work. First, Russell is going to give us a talk. He'll have 40 minutes for that. After that, Guilherme will have up to 30 minutes to make his comments and present his own view on the matter. And finally, Russell's going to have another 10 minutes to reply Guilherme's comments. After that, we'll open the discussion to the audience, so everybody here is welcome to ask questions for both Russell and Guilherme, and we'll have another 40 minutes for that. And after that, finally, we end the meeting. So now, if everything is in place, I'll invite Russell to begin his talk. Russell, can you hear me? Are you ready?
I can. I'm ready to go. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, we're hearing you fine. I'm hearing you fine. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, Felipe for organizing this and for having me, and for Guy for once again, I guess, for the second time commentating on this this paper, the first time in print and now here. So it's very exciting opportunity. So I'll get right to it. I'm going to talk about enactivism, utopian and scientific. I'm going to begin. First, I'll just say quickly who I am. As is already mentioned, I'm at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, the Institute of Philosophy. We're a very new institute. I'm really interested in biology of cognition more broadly, so certainly enactivist approaches, also a variety of others. I'm interested in model organisms. I read a lot about spiders lately. And explanatory strategies in biological and cognitive sciences. And Nick, my co-author, who is also here, is an independent scholar. She's a philosopher of science. And right now she does perhaps more important work than philosophy, working for a non-profit, spreading the light of philosophy and ethics in primary schools in Australia. So that's us, lapsed enactivists. So let me start by talking about the enactive revolution. This is really just to tee up the main discussion. So enaction has been talked about a lot in the past as a paradigm, as some kind of revolutionary shift in cognitive science. There's been a lot of evoking of the notion of a paradigm shift, of Kuhnian paradigm shifts, and the idea that cognitivism, whatever that may be, sort of the mainstream, is the target of an enactive sort of overthrow or some kind of radical change. So me and Nick started out kind of this whole project, right? We started with a previous paper putting down the revolt, Enactivism as a philosophy of nature, and have kind of closed that loop in the paper that I'm mostly going to talk about today. But just to give you kind of the idea of where we're coming from. So Pierre Steiner, who I believe has been a previous Clear Invites speaker, has talked about how, well, you know, there's a few problems with that kind of Kuhnian approach. First of all, there doesn't really seem to be a collapse in cognitivism in the mainstream. Mainly because while you can critique cognitivism from the outside, from enactivism, from a set of enactivist assumptions, that doesn't really create problems that are critical within the existing paradigm. And that's really where where those problems have to come from in order for there to be some serious trouble. So there's no imminent takeover by enactivism. I don't think that anyone would argue that there is. So what gives? Why is there not a revolution? I'll very quickly run through kind of what enactivism's case is, why it doesn't really work, and that will lead us through to the main discussion that I'm going to press today. So on the one hand, enactivism has this kind of hard sell, the idea that enactivism is a better choice over cognitivism. So one way this is pursued is by talking about an explanatory gap. So there's something missing in the mainstream. It might be there's not enough talk about the subjective aspects of consciousness, cognition, so consciousness, phenomenology. And the idea is enactivism maybe covers those deficiencies, provides better explanations, some might say. And this threatens to collapse enactivism. So one of the big examples gets used quite often, comes from social cognition. I think people are pretty familiar with this discussion and some of the main examples. I'll just quickly say this is a nice contrast between what enactivists propose as an explanation for a common cognitive phenomenon, that is that of social cognition, and what the mainstream offers. So the mainstream offers the mind reading account, the idea that we might simulate or theorize sort of at a distance about the thoughts of others. While an enactivist or an active inspired alternative interactionism suggests that actually a lot of what we do socially in a direct, first personal, very much embodied sort of manner, we're not typically doing this kind of speculation at a distance that theory and simulation theory propose. So most everyday social cognition is quite direct instead. There are differing explanations of how this works. So you have the classic Sally and Anne false belief test paradigm, wherein you have a child watch this kind of play get acted out. One of these characters hides an object, leaves the room. The other character moves that object to another hiding place. When the first character, Sally, comes back, you ask the child, where is Sally going to look for her marble? Well, there's been much ado about these sorts of experiments. But at the end of the day, we have two very different ways of conceptualizing the phenomenon of social cognition and two different ways of interpreting the results. So interactionists say, well, children are being tested on something too complex. They do develop social cognition quite early. We're just asking them to make these linguistic sort of third-personal reports. Traditional approaches, beg to differ. Some find this position uncompelling. So Gallagher's sort of interactionist story. Because, so we've got Peter Carruthers here saying that for all the efforts that have been made in the interactionist, from the interactionist framework, Carruthers thinks literally no new discoveries have resulted. And he thinks this is basically because unless you're explaining how internal processes in the brain represent, for instance, through theorization or simulation, the mental states of others, you're not explaining social cognition. So it's a hard no from Carruthers. We might think, well, doesn't enactivism offer a viable alternative, though? I mean, interactionism is its own kind of detailed account. We come to a pretty basic problem here in the philosophy of science, that is, of background beliefs and assumptions. So when we're evaluating what is the better explanation, it comes down to quite often what our background beliefs or assumptions are. So here's Ellen Longino talking about how a given state of affairs can be taken as evidence for the same hypothesis in light of differing background beliefs, and it can be taken as evidence for quite different and even conflicting hypotheses given appropriately conflicting background beliefs. So whether you come into things as an interactionist and an activist or a cognitivist really determines which explanation of, for instance, social cognition you find more compelling. And so within a cognitivist set of assumptions, you're not really wrong to think that activist explanations are just not really explanations at all. They don't hit the kind of exponentia that you're interested in. So this is just a problem of underdetermination. And the same thing goes, mainstream approaches often don't consider phenomenal consciousness to be as core to the business of, for instance, psychological explanations as enactivists do. Their background assumptions are simply different. So for them, there is no gap. The hard sell of enactivism doesn't really work that well. It's hard to prove that enactivists simply have better explanations. It seems to come down to what your background assumptions are. So the soft sell says, all right, well, enactivism might not be objectively better or something. It might not have better explanations. Maybe it's more conceptually elegant. It's a little more lithe. It's a little more stripped down. So we have Hutto and Mayan here talking about how, what we want to do to create enactivist accounts. Here they're talking about an account of mathematical reasoning. They say if we subtract any residual commitment to mental representation, information processing stories, and neurofetishism, subtract any residual constructivism, anti-realism, and idealistic elements from the account. And finally, subtract any lingering psychologism. It's all about subtraction, elegance. We me and Nick kind of argued that this really more looks like an argument from aesthetics than anything more convincing. There's also kind of an appeal to the prima facie, so sensory motor life has a few instances of this. So mainstream explanations, quote, to many people do not match well the situated and richly context-dependent experiences and activities they enact every day. So it's just kind of plainly obvious that, an enactivist explanation is better. A careful look at what we know about our bodies, our biology, the way they organize themselves, a look at the way we experience the world as situated creatures, tells a rather different story. So enactivism is just kind of like more intuitively appealing, is the claim. So conceptual elegance, this kind of aesthetic position, it's not really a reason to abandon the mainstream, unless that really appeals to you. But it's not much of a knockdown argument. The prima facie kind of observations, say from sensory motor life, is enactivism somehow devoid of background assumptions? Is it a clearer look than cognitivism? it seems debatable. It seems like there's just a different set of background assumptions at work. So we don't really find the soft sell of enactivism that compelling either. Instead, we want to think of enactivism, or one of its possible roles, is as a philosophy of nature. We draw on PGS and Sean Gallagher here. A philosophy of nature is more like an overarching kind of understanding of life and mind. It integrates concepts across different research programs. It solves what Sean Gallagher calls the clunky robot problem. So the idea that people working on different solutions in different branches of a particular science might kind of put together explanations or models, or even, I mean, could literally be robotics, but systems that successfully are able to exhibit a phenomenon of interest, but when put together, they don't really form a cohesive story model of cognition. So having some kind of overarching set of ontological positions, assumptions, beliefs, this kind of helps to unify an entire research tradition project together. So it's kind of bringing us up to speed. If enactivism isn't this revolution that's supposed to happen, if the revolution isn't about to happen or isn't happening, but it does contribute a philosophy of nature, then what ultimately is enactivism doing? Apart from providing this overarching story, is it generating research? If so, of what kind? Is it a unified project, or is it a bunch of different things? Does it contribute to scientific outcomes? Or is it mostly a philosophical venture? So what myself and Nick noticed when working on the previous paper and then developing the idea for Utopian and Scientific was, we noticed, and having been sort of raised within the enactivist milieu, Nick hates that word, but I'm going to say it anyway. A lot of theoretical work expands the enactive story. So there's enactive accounts of everything. And these are often set up in direct opposition to mainstream accounts. This is a pattern. But the question is, how closely does this actually impact or inform on empirical work? And we saw not typically. On the other hand, there does genuinely seem to be an activist work in the sciences or informing the sciences. It just seems to be a pretty small slice of the pie. So the question is, what's going on? That's kind of the question we wanted to answer. What really is the project of enactivism? Is it even a single project? Well, the short answer is no, it's two projects. And the long answer is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my talk here. So enactivism, we'll get this out of the way, often gets broken down into like autopoietic, sensory motor, radical enactivist traditions. We're not really messing around with those too much, because we identify what we think is a deeper division that we think makes a lot better sense of what's going on in enactivism and where it's come from and where it's going, than what the particular kind of theoretical bona fides or hills that are being died upon of autopoietic versus sensory motor versus radical enactivists. So we think utopian and scientific enactivism are quite different, but definitely intertwined with one another. And sometimes to their detriment, actually. It might be better for them if they were to remain separate, we want to suggest. Utopian enactivism, so it's trying to build a philosophy of nature. That's this philosophically defensible constellation of ideas and concepts about life and mind. And scientific enactivism is trying to intervene into scientific practice much more directly. And our test for what fits where within the enactive kind of body of work, whether it's utopian or scientific, is just this. It's scientific enactivism if it involves empirical work, or it has a clear and feasible roadmap for immediate and direct integration with current empirical research in the cognitive sciences, with an emphasis on clear and feasible and immediate and direct. So here's what we put together. We looked at what enactivism does in terms of its research output and the topics it's interested in. And we found that we could kind of put these into a couple of categories. So the first of these is the integration of phenomenology. So integrating phenomenology into cognitive science. The second is investigating organizing principles of cognition and life. Third is investigating patterns of perception and action, and expanding the explanatory reach of organizing principles. And finally, entrenching enactivism against criticism. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So the integration of phenomenology. So this is a pretty big project and pretty core to enactivism, I would say. So we have Thompson here saying that once science turns its attention to subjectivity and consciousness, it cannot do without phenomenology, which thus needs to be recognized and cultivated as an indispensable partner to the experimental sciences of life and mind. Similarly, Noe takes the position that sensory motor enactivism should avoid the pitfalls of denying the holistic character of consciousness, eliminating persons in favor of the brain or other subpersonal substitutes, and attempting to think of presence, which to him is very important, as a matter of representation. So the idea is, as we found it, was this is a project of filling missing pieces in a philosophy of nature. It's not really offering anything that can be kind of immediately tested out or operationalized in kind of the psychological science sense. But instead, it's trying to construct and add to a philosophy of nature to show how phenomenology, the phenomenon of consciousness, all fit together with our science. The exception here is neurophenomenology, which does directly and also comes from Thompson, Gallagher, many others, which does try to actually put this into practice scientifically. So the second project, sub-project of enactivism, autopoietic theory, right? Matron and Varela, one of the kind of core founding kind of notions behind enactivism. Very much a live research subject in terms of models thereof, the usefulness of the idea. There's a lot of work still going on, demonstrating the utility of these concepts like autopoiesis, structural coupling. It's scientific enactivism. Investigating patterns of perception and action. This is our third project. So O'Regan and Noe, kind of spawning sensory motor enactivism, have a lot of concrete proposals for testing their ideas. And as part of that developing project is research on change blindness, color perception, so the role of motor activity and action on the perception of color, come directly out of this project, and with an ongoing influence. This is scientific enactivism. These ideas have been put into practice, they've been tested out. So this is a little more controversial, I think. Expanding the explanatory reach of organizing principles. So enactivism has a really solid base when it comes to autopoietic theory and the origins of origins, but the overlap of life and cognition at this cellular kind of scale. So the autopoietic tradition also provides this notion of autonomy, the kind of generic version of autopoiesis. Autopoiesis is specifically about the kind of molecular physics of cells. Autonomy, this here is Brandy-Arend, says it's a type of process organization that is constituted as a network of interdependent processes where the behavior of the whole emerges from the interaction dynamics of its component parts in a self-organized manner. So this doesn't have to just be cells, this can be all other kinds of systems at different kinds of scales. So self-producing and self-maintaining systems that generate their own boundaries. One example of how this gets kind of taken up in enactivism, this general notion of autonomy, Thompson, for instance, suggests that more sophisticated psychological capacities, so selfhood and consciousness, kind of emerge out of autopoiesis, right? Out of this basic kind of this basic form of autonomy or cellular form of autonomy that we call autopoiesis. And so, kind of born out of this notion that we want to expand enactivism, we don't want it to just be about cells, we want it to be about all those scales in between cells and human psychology, human cultures even. So there's enactive accounts of neuroscience, psychiatry, artificial intelligence, even socio-political conflict, sort of going beyond the individual, beyond even just social cognition into like institutions, ethics, health and disease, emotion. So we see the project here, what people are trying to do is construct an overarching, encompassing, philosophically consistent, enactive ontology that goes from cellular life all the way out to institutions. This is a philosophy of nature. This is utopian enactivism. With an important exception, work on participatory sense-making from Diego de Paulo, which investigates autonomy within social cognition. So there's perceptual crossing experiments. This has been implemented. It's scientific enactivism. But for the most part, and we would say this sort of Project 4 encompasses a lot of enactive work, is coming up with enactive accounts of X. So the fifth and final one, project, is entrenching enactivism against criticism. So critiquing cognitivism, it's a long-standing enactive tradition, almost like kind of a initiation rite. You have to kind of smack talk cognitivism before you're allowed in. Radical enactivism is the classic example of this, kind of it's the foot in the door that it gets before it tries to offer its own account, is that of rectifying, stripping out the offending commitments of other enactivisms, of mainstream accounts, cleanse, purify, strengthen, and unify a whole set of existing anti-representational offerings. So the goal here is shoring up the philosophical defensibility of enactivism. This is utopian enactivism. There's no proposals that are intervening in science here. So utopian enactivism. Let's talk about that now. We've kind of sorted what people are doing in enactivism into scientific and utopian. Let's talk about what utopianism is. So I do want to stress, we don't want to say that utopian enactivism is bad. That's not what I want to imply or argue for. Or that scientific enactivism is inherently good. What I'm trying to argue for is that they're two different things that have been treated as the same thing for quite a long time, I think to the detriment of enactivism, as I'll talk about a little more. So some problems that have emerged from this confusion about what enactivism is and confusion of the utopian and the scientific I think one problem is that utopian and activist offerings often make the mistake of arguing about what scientists ought to be doing. So finding theoretical like cracks in the slab and trying to suggest that, right, cognitive science has to change its ways in response to this kind of theoretical problem we've found, kind of in the tradition, I guess, of like Dreyfus, Searle in the past. And a lot of this is directed at cognitivism specifically, that there's problems with the notion of representation, for instance, that undermine the whole thing. And, you know, what we suggest is that this is kind of using an outdated monolithic conception of cognitivism, as though cognitive science, everyone in there is committed to this kind of hard representationalist, like Fodorian story about the mind, when it just doesn't really seem like that's the case. Specific research programs have precise tasks. So the demands for cognitive science to like adopt enactivism is not all that helpful. If we're saying, for instance, you have to integrate phenomenology, well, research in mainstream cognitive science already does. The same goes for embodiment. So Jody Russell has recently talked about problems in enactive psychiatry, going to psychiatrists and saying, all right, start doing enactivism, is much too coarse-grained to actually offer something helpful. And it, again, holds this assumption that outside of enactivism, there's some kind of monolithic set of antagonistic commitments that need to be kind of washed away and replaced by something enactive. So we think that utopian interventions into scientific enactivism are therefore kind of unhelpful. Really, they're just they're exhortations to adopt a new set of beliefs without really providing for why that would be desirable, in what way specifically that can actually be applied to a particular project. Another issue we find in these interactions is the notion of virtuous pagans. So there's a preoccupation we find with finding the enactivists avant la lettre. I guess that's my best attempt. Gallagher, you know, for instance, Sean Gallagher looks for enactivist elements in phenomenology. So kind of looking back up the genealogical tree, looking for the precursors to enactivism already there, right? Enactivism already kind of in the blood. Paulo talks about Jean Piaget as an enactivist. Even back to the embodied mind, to Rella, Thompson, and Roche, identify Rodney Brooks, AI, roboticist. They identify his work as like enactivism at work, being akin to enactivism. This is Brooks here, looking suitably disdainful, as his usual countenance. But Brooks wasn't an enactivist. And we question whether this is a worthwhile strategy. If work can meet enactive goals without adopting all enactive commitments, then what's the point of adopting all those commitments? Right, Rodney Brooks, it's building robotics, intelligence without representation, his famous paper, that really, his commitments really jive with a lot of what embodied approaches, non-representational approaches were doing, what enactivists are advocating, and seeing a lot of research success. But he was not an enactivist, he does not hold enactive positions across the board. So we might wonder if this is not actually enactivism undermining itself by claiming people from outside the tradition as sort of enactivists before the fact. It makes enactivism look less necessary. So scientific enactivism is a much smaller thing. I'll move on to kind of talking about what scientific enactivism is now. It's small, but it exists. So we do have, for instance, the development of new technologies, testing equipment for testing out enactivist ideas, the enactive torch, For instance, a bit of kit trying to investigate enactivist hypotheses. Autonomous robotics, evolutionary modeling methodology. So Randall Beer, very much inspired by enactivism. I wouldn't say he would call himself an enactivist, but so even more recently, kind of simulated models, testing out enactivist ideas on sensory motor contingencies, the formation of habits. Beer again, models of autonomy, precariousness, structural coupling, boundary maintenance in a sample universe. He's been doing a lot with the game of life. And enactivism has had some influence in dynamical systems oriented work, infant development, so work on infant perseverative reaching, Esther Taylor and Linda Smith. Again, not really enactivists, but picking up enactive ideas and integrating it into a broader project to its benefit. And of course, neurophenomenology. Two tastes that taste really bad together. So the question is, why not just integrate these two things? Maybe what I've identified here, what me and Nick have identified, is that there's just a split in enactivism. We need to resolve that and bring the two things back together, the scientific and the utopian, together at last. But they're really at cross purposes. The needs of scientific tasks can necessitate sacrificing philosophical defensibility. So Mario Villalobos, one of his commentary on Utopian and Scientific, makes a really good case for this, that he kind of shows how research has actively been held back by trying to hold too closely to the kind of correct position in enactivist terms. And, you know, we would suggest that you're going to have some idealization, you're going to have some loosening of these commitments, some impurities. So we don't think that the solution is that these two things should join together. They have different purposes. They're doing different things. And when they talk with one another, when they try to assert their positions, it doesn't work out well. So all or nothing enactivism is what I'll kind of, not quite wrap with, but this is kind of the coda to the main discussion. So this kind of comes from our response to the commentaries that we got on this article. And we sort of lay our cards on the table a little bit, and I'll talk that through here about all or nothing enactivism, this idea of insisting that the whole suite of enactivism must be accepted. You've got to take all the enactive commitments on board before you can do anything useful. And I think, you know, I just talked about the conflict between scientific and utopian enactivism. This really is a big contributor to that. We suggest that if you want to make progress in the scientific side of things, then you need to be a little bit more pluralistic and a little more fine-grained than that. It doesn't really pay to demand that people sort of pay homage to all the enactivist commitments before they can get on with doing their work. Because we think it's okay to take what's useful and leave behind what isn't. You know, it's okay to pick out autopoietic theory if that's useful for your account. Basal cognition, the biogenic sort of approach is doing really well, having done just that. Plucking a little bit of enactivism out for its own benefit. I talked about Randall Beer doing very much the same thing, structural coupling, autopoietic theory. I'm sure that you can do this in many different cases. You don't have to take the whole thing on board for it to work. And it's going to depend on each specific project, what's useful and what's not. There's no kind of deep, or at least we're not compelled by the idea that there's some important sort of metaphysical reason or something why you have to accept the whole enactive story. And what I wanted to push was the idea of the end of enactivism as an ism, specifically. Not the end of enactivist ideas, but the end of enactivism as this whole suite of beliefs that must be accepted. As a monolith, right? The competing monolith against the imagined monolith of cognitivism. Enactive ideas, I want to stress, are living, vital things, not foretellings. I think too often they're treated as, back in Maturana and Varela, or Varela, Thompson, and Roche, in the classic sort of text of enactivism, that it was all laid out back then and that they got it all right and we just have to keep playing out that project. And I just don't think that there's much reason to go in that direction. These are ideas that people have proposed and that we can make use of as we see fit. I think breaking away from the notion of these canonical holy texts might be a little excessive, but I want to push the idea that there's this canon that we don't want to question and that has to be taken as a whole and can't be kind of taken apart, and used for parts as we need. Because, if we're frank, if we'd had it all figured out back in the 80s or 90s, then we wouldn't be needing to have these discussions right now. We would have figured out cognition. We would have figured out the continuity of life and mind. We would have integrated subjectivity into cognitive science. So the question for me is, that I think is going to be interesting for enactivism going forward, is where can enactive ideas be used fruitfully to generate new knowledge? Not enactivism as a whole, not necessarily the whole kind of kit and caboodle, but particular ideas. So that's me. I think I'm just under time. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Russell. You were a bit earlier than time. You still had 2 minutes, but that's perfect. Thanks a lot. So,
excellent.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can.
Okay. Thank you so much. Very interesting, wonderful talk. Loved it. I have questions for later also. But let me now invite Guilherme to begin his talk. Guilherme, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. Okay, I can hear you fine. I just can't see you. Not sure, but if you're with your camera off,
yeah, I can see you.
Oh, I can see you now.
Okay.
Okay. So, Guilherme, you have now up to 30 minutes to make your comments and present your view as you like. So, whenever you're ready,
Sure.
You're welcome to begin.
I'll try to share my screen then. So, let's see. Entire screen. Okay, can you see it?
No, I can't see it. Okay. I guess I can see it.
Yep.
Yep, let me see.
I have it full screen. Yep, is that good to go?
I can see it. I think good to go.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks everyone for the invitation, Felipe for the invitation, and everyone else for being part of this. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And yeah, I'm going to be basically presenting and framing and situating my response, my commentary, rather to their target article. And the title I have here for right now is this: Inaction, Reflexivity, and the Utopian versus Scientific Distinction. So I'll jump right in. Of course, the context is their target article and my commentary on it. In that commentary, I talked about resisting the distinction, right? So I think there are reasons for not accepting it as they're proposing it, but I'll explain why, and I'll say some things that are not in the commentary. The commentary will have things that I'm not talking about, and so I invite everyone to read the target article and all the commentaries, including mine. But I thought I would, frame, situate the ideas and add some different things, and hopefully it will be useful for the discussion that will follow. So I'll start with a concession, maybe it's a confession or something like that, which is also what I start the commentary with. And the concession and confession is that I think Russell and Nick are right. There's this rhetoric of a revolution around enactivism, right? It seems that enactivists want a revolution of some sort, and I think Russell and Nick are spot on in finding, well, the revolution hasn't happened, and maybe it won't, right? We don't have indications that it will, or at least we need to think carefully about what the revolution is supposed to be. The relation between enactivism, and I underline the ism there, and we can talk about it. I won't focus on it too much, but I think it's an important question also that Russell mentioned at the end. But anyway, right, I think they are right in identifying this disconnect between what enactivists seem to want, at least sometimes, right, and what actually is accomplished in relation to cognitive science. There's a gap between enactivism and cognitive science with regard to the resources, the tools that are used, and it seems, at least in some cases, many cases, also with regard to the objectives. So I think they're right in identifying this, and I agree that it's worth thinking about the relation between enactivism and cognitive science. Besides that, and I mentioned this in my commentary as well, I think it's can be helpful to be clear on where I'm coming from, right? My perspective, my commentary is not written from, it's not a view from nowhere. My own background is in Gibsonian ecological psychology, and to be honest, as I was being raised in ecological psychology, I always saw enactivism as this other thing that's similar in some ways, but not quite, right? And my impression from within, coming from the ecological psychology, was that enactivism is philosophy, right? And ecological psychology is not. So there are, I think, reasons in favor of seeing things this way, and that's the reason I have thought of things in this way for a while, although not right now, and that's what my commentary is about. But one reason in favor of dividing things up in this way, right? Ecological psychology is science, and enactivism is philosophy, is this. Ecological psychology started out as a research program in experimental psychology, right? It was articulated as such. That was the intention, and that's what it's been for decades, right? Since the really 60s, 70s. And what happens with this, one consequence of it being a scientific project, an experimental project, right, or research program, is that practitioners need common ground. They perceive the need for common ground. They see it as being important that they have shared a shared understanding of what the problems are that need to be dealt with, right, and how to do that, how to solve those problems. Very much in line with the Acunian idea of a paradigm, right? You need to have something in common so that, right, you can accomplish certain practical goals, and that would be normal science, right? It's solving puzzles. I'm not saying that ecological psychologists necessarily embrace the Acunian gloss, but I've seen firsthand this concern with, we need to make sure we're building upon, we're part of the same project, right? This is ecological psychologists in relation to other ecological psychologists. There's a need for common ground, for the experiments to be seen as contributions to the same enterprise rather than, to something else. And my impression, being trained in this context of ecological psychology for a long time, has been that enactivism is different, because it seems to be like most philosophy in that it's less constrained, right? There's less of this concern with agreeing, really, with agreeing and with building something together, right? Accomplishing these goals of scientific research. Like most philosophy, enactivists seem to be more free to speculate and come up with their own view, and they seem to be okay if if they're the only ones who think a certain way, right? There's less of a concern with agreeing with others, with interlocutors, and in that sense, it's more individualistic too. Although I do know that and Russell mentioned this in his talk today, there is still this in enactivism this concern with the canon, with the Matrona Varela, the roots and the right ideas, and wanting to those original the prophets or whatever, right? To have to finding their works the roots for everything. They need to have gotten everything right, and we just need to find, but it was there already. This is very much similar to what happens in ecological psychology, especially in more like hardcore Gibsonian circles, right? Ecological psychologists want to find, oh no, but Gibson said this, and it was already there, and we're just developing it, and so on, right? So there's this is a similarity, right? But in other respects, there are dissimilarities, and this is my perspective, right? What my background and where I'm coming from, right? Where I approach the question of enactivism as utopian or scientific. It's in light of this way of thinking. Although for some time too, I've been thinking that that's not quite right. And in the commentary, I try to explore a slightly different way of thinking about enactivism. And in particular, the goal there is to think of what enactivists might think or should think or could think about enactivism, right? And that's what I highlighted here, that maybe the motivation for resisting the distinction between utopian enactivism and scientific enactivism, maybe the motivation can be enactive commitments already. So that's what I'll talk about. I wanted to first mention the problem of demarcation, right? It might seem like a complete change of subject. This is a traditional problem in philosophy of science, right? What the problem of defining what science is, coming up with an account of the boundaries, trying to find the characteristics that define science and that distinguish it from other practices, from pseudoscience, from non-scientific practices, and so on. The problem with demarcation, of course, what makes it problematic is that it's hard to say what demarcates science from other things, right? The history of philosophy of science has been a succession of attempts to find the criterion or criteria. So for defining science. But I wanted to mention here, so you can also think that there's the problem of demarcation, but there's a problem with the concern with demarcating, right? So now we're thinking about the question itself. What is science? Rather than trying to answer the question, I'm inviting you all to think about the question itself. And I'm saying here, who wants to know? And it's not like, it's not a dismissive, who cares? But it's really, again, thinking of whose view is it that where this question arises, right? Because questions, this one, other questions, they don't ask themselves. Someone is asking those questions. And that is, right, there's someone has a motivation for seeing a problem and wanting to answer it. And so when it comes to this concern with traditional concern with demarcation, right, identifying criteria that define this is science and this is not, right? Traditionally, it's a view of philosophy that I would say is now outdated, right? It's this traditional concern with ideal science, with the rational foundations for scientific knowledge, in contrast with, studying science as practiced in the real world, right? In philosophy of science, right, there's this big shift in the past, really half century, right? Moving away from thinking about, science as this ideal thing, and instead thinking, well, what do scientists actually do? That's what we need to understand, not some ideal that might not be realized anywhere in the real world, right? And when it comes to the real world, scientific practices are diverse. And so this shift in what we think about what philosophy is, what philosophy should study, right? In this case, philosophy of science, right? What is a philosophy of science after? It's not after an understanding of an ideal of science, but real science, right? This is what I mean by who's asking this question. The people who asked the question, who really cared about demarcation, had a certain view of what it meant to philosophically reflect on science, right? In particular, not caring about what science is like in the real world. So, Russell and Nick are not getting into the question, the problem of demarcation. That's not what their paper is about, right? But I do think that there's some amount of continuity with the questions they're asking, right? So I think that at the background of this kind of concern with separating things out and categorizing them, right, as scientific rather than philosophical, or as philosophical rather than scientific, right? There's something in common or in continuity with this traditional concern with demarcation, right? And some just 3 points here. What I think what's problematic about the concern is this, right? So first of all, there's no philosophy-free science, right? And I think everyone here would agree. Science is built upon philosophical assumptions. There's a lot of philosophy that goes into, even if it's unarticulated, unacknowledged, right? It rests on science, scientific, on philosophy, that is, philosophical foundations. Not only that, though, but there's also partial overlap in the tools, methods, and goals between what we might call, in some contexts we call philosophy, and what in other contexts we call science, right? And I think that's especially clear when it comes to theoretical disciplines or theoretical aspects of certain scientific disciplines, right? Theoretical biology, theoretical psychology, theoretical physics, mathematics, right? There are these domains where there are reasons for calling them, saying this is science, it's not philosophy, but without those reasons, we wouldn't, of course, be inclined to do that, right? We would otherwise acknowledge that, this idea or project in theoretical biology or in mathematics or physics or whatever, that is a philosophical project in essence, right? So what are those reasons that lead us to categorizing projects in this way? I think maybe this is not the whole story, but it's an important part of the story. It's the sociological and institutional separation of disciplines, which is a relatively new thing, right? It's over the last century or two, not even two, right? With universities becoming what they are now and so on, right? So there's a history. These categories that they lead to some work being categorized or seen as philosophical rather than scientific, or scientific rather than philosophical, when without the categories they wouldn't be distinguished necessarily, or in a different point in time they wouldn't be distinguished. And I think it's important to keep this in mind. So that's the parallel that I want to draw with the enactivism question, right? I want to encourage us all to think of this like, who's asking this question, right? Or to put it differently, could it be that different people will answer the question differently, right? And I think enactivists might have their own answer, an answer to the, is enactivism scientific or philosophical or whatever, right? They might have a different answer. The answer might not be the same for everyone. So the gist of what I'm proposing here and in the commentary is this, right? Distinguishing between utopian or philosophical and properly scientific projects within the broader family of enactive views can be philosophically useful. And I can see that, and without any problem. I'm interested in what implications enactivism might have for evaluating the distinction, right? That is, it could be that the distinction is useful for some ends, but not for other ends. It could be that it's useful given certain assumptions, but not given other assumptions. And my suspicion and my suggestion is that for certain ends and according to certain assumptions that we find in enactivism, there's reason for resisting the distinction. That's what I say in my commentary. I say, if we take for granted currently dominant categorizations of types of knowledge and of academic disciplines and university departments, it seems reasonable to draw very sharp boundaries separating, on the one hand, philosophy and philosophical projects from, on the other hand, science and scientific projects. Yet should enactivists take for granted these dichotomies and separations? My proposal is that enactivism has consequences that are not confined to the domain of psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind, but that extend to philosophy of science as well, or meta-science. Right? If we follow enactivists in how they rethink mind, cognition, brain, behavior, life, and nature, then this ought to inform also how we understand what science is, and by extension, what counts as scientific. And consequently, right, whether enactivism should be categorized as scientific or philosophical. Right, so that's, like I said, I think a motivation for resisting the distinction is adopting a reflexive stance from within enactivism. By reflexivity, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but there are different concepts, notions of reflexivity. I draw from Bloor and other people in the sociology of scientific knowledge, where they say, look, we're giving these sociological explanations of how science works, of how ideas change in science, theories, and so on. And we're saying that it's due to these theories and methods that I have highlighted there, they emanate from society, right? They're the product of collective influences. They're peculiar to culture, to space and time, to context, right? Reflexivity, as developed in this context, was the idea that this sociological explanation of scientific knowledge should be given, should allow for the recognition that the sociological explanation itself is also, emanating from society, that it's also the product of collective influences and peculiar to the culture and context and so on. So to illustrate that, right? So the sociologist of scientific knowledge, Bloor and other people, they're saying, oh, look, right? People are subject to these social factors, collective influences. Their ideas and theories and so on are peculiar to culture and to context. Reflexivity is the step of recognizing that the same must be the case, right? The same explanation given about the behavior of other people must apply to the sociologist in this case, right? But I think it's an interesting concept and tool for thinking, right? Because it applies to anything, not only to the sociology of scientific knowledge, right? When you think about the dominant paradigm, and I do think that, right, I agree with the criticism of like the monolithic idea of cognitivism, but I do think that there's enough in common that from a certain perspective, it makes sense to, contrast enactivism with cognitivism or ecological psychology with it. But we can talk about that later, right? But anyway, the point is that reflexivity applies also to cognitivism. If we're we're explaining, human behavior in terms of information processing, well, the behavior of explaining human behavior should also be given in the same terms, right? If we give an account of behavior in terms of, active inference, there are many different accounts, or just some kind of predictions, then the same sort of account should apply to your activity of explaining those behaviors. Whatever it is, right? When it comes to explanations of humans and human activities, there's this kind of circularity that's important to be aware of. And of course, my point is that this is also part of enactivism, right? That is, enactivists give accounts of various aspects of human behavior. There's, as Russell pointed out, right? There's an active view of X or whatever it is. One of those X's is, for example, scientific explanation, right? So through that kind of move, there's a possibility of an active understanding that encompasses not only, mind, cognition, life, nature, but also science as something that people do. In a recent paper, I developed some of these ideas, not focusing on enactivism specifically, but like stepping back and thinking of, those ideas that enactivism and ecological psychology have in common, to, kind of just a more radical embodied perspective in general. And of course, what's common there is the rejection of this internalist view of cognition as information processing that happens in someone's head, right, where the body is peripheral, and instead this emphasis on cognition as an interaction or the product of a brain-body world system. So there are processes, there are cognitive processes, but they're not processes of processing information, right? They're relations. They're relational explanations of cognition. So the idea of reflexivity then is this: if this is right, this way of thinking about cognition is right, then what does it mean for how we understand science? Specifically, as something that people do, right? Scientists. So what I suggest in that paper is something like this, right? It's just, well, the same account must apply at all levels, right? Not only the level of the behavior observed, but also at the level of the observer talking about, describing, explaining, trying to understand that object of investigation. So, like I said, that's a broad, radical 4E or 5E or whatever view that I articulated in that paper. But I see the same idea being present in enactivism from the start, throughout, up until today. And I don't mean this to be like, oh, look, they said it back then, therefore it's right. But they did say it back then. And that reveals, I think, a concern from the start, right? It's not a new idea. It's been around. So in this very old piece of writing by Matrona Varela, this is, I think, from 1970, came out in English in 80, but it's from 70. And so there they start drawing some of these distinctions that will inform later on enactivism, distinction between the system and the observer. And this is a part that Matrona wrote, and he said, the observer is a human being, that is a living system. And whatever applies to living systems applies also to him, right? So I see that as the same biological principles of self-organization, autonomy, and adaptation that explain the simplest forms of life, also being used for explaining how our functional organization, and this is again a quote, gives rise to such phenomena as conceptual thinking, language, and self-consciousness. This is something that they were sensitive to, right? This need for recognizing the extent to which our ideas about mind, cognition, behavior, life, and so on apply to us as observers, as cognitive agents. This is also something that comes up a little bit later in the Tree of Knowledge, where Matrona Varela, developed this view of cognition as the activity of living beings bringing forth the world. And they ask this question: how can we know that we've given a satisfactory scientific explanation of cognition in building up this framework? They say that they'll know when, and that's the quote, we have set forth a conceptual system that can generate the cognitive phenomenon as a result of the action of a living being. And when we have shown that this process can produce living beings like ourselves, able to generate descriptions and reflect on them as a result of their fulfillment as living beings operating effectively in their fields of existence. So this is, right, they're trying to use the same terms that they use for talking about a bunch of other phenomena to making sense of the nature and even the evaluation of the quality of the explanation they're given, right? Rather than it being, rather than these conceptual tools, right, and the theoretical framework and all that, applying only in one place and not applying to themselves. They're clearly interested in making clear that it does apply to their efforts. So the result is, this is again quoting from this book, the result is tracing autonomy from the realm of the biological all the way up to the human, including the activity of scientists like ourselves. And so I want to highlight here, right, that including the activity of scientists, and so this is a reflective step, a reflective move, but also highlight like ourselves, right? So they see the project that they're developing as a scientific project. And I think that's interesting to consider. It's important to take into account. Not because they were right because of who they were or anything like that, or like this founding fathers or whatever. But rather to see that there is this concern from the start, and it's something that has continued. And these are just 3 examples of papers that have come out in the past 2 years. one I've been a part of, scientific practice as ecological and active co-construction, but then other papers, Tom Freuze, who also, of course, came up in Russell's talk, talking about scientific observation and participatory realism. And another paper that came out very recently, Making Sense of Doing Science. So an enactive approach to science. So I'm going to try to get ready to wrap up here. I see the question that Russell and Nick is raising, right? As this, where do we put enactivism? And I have the embodied mind there just as a placeholder for enactivism, right? Should we put it in the science box, in the philosophy box? Maybe one way to think about their proposal is this, right? Some of it goes in one box and some of it goes in another box. And I think that can be a useful way to think about things, right? But I think it's not the only way, and it's not the only useful way to think about things, because it's also possible, and I think fruitful to think about how the enactive perspective gives us reason to reject the boxes, to say these boxes, right? This is a false dichotomy, right? There are reasons for not wanting to place it in any of the boxes, and for asking for other boxes if we need boxes at all. Right, so there's talk of wanting a revolution, and activists starting or working toward some kind of revolution. This is what something I say toward the end of my commentary, right? Rather than taking for granted currently dominant categories and divisions, including those between what is properly scientific and what is only philosophical, enactivism has this potential of challenging the categories and divisions and to work to change the world, academic, intellectual, cultural, but not only, right? So enactivism offers new ways to understand mind, cognition, embodiment, knowledge, etc. But it doesn't have to stop there. It can also inspire new ways to understand our understanding of those phenomena, resisting oppressive disciplinary structures, and paving the way for fundamental change in the means of knowledge production, the ends of knowledge production. A little bit playing with their reference to Marx and Engels and all that, but I think it's only partly joking. So to end with a visual illustration of what I'm talking about here, right? So there's the utopian scientific distinction, right? From outside enactivism, I think you can philosophically evaluate enactivism and the different projects, different ideas and theories, different publications over the years, right? You can evaluate from outside of enactivism and you can be excited about the distinction, right? But I think at the same time, it's possible for enactivists from within enactivism, thinking about what they do through an enactive lens, right? To not be as excited about the distinction. It doesn't mean, right? I'm not trying to suggest that that this external view of enactivism is wrong, right? I'm not saying it's untenable, illogical, incoherent, or anything like that, right? Honestly, right? Recognizing this can be useful. What I'm trying to say then is that this other perspective, where you're not as excited about the distinction for enactive or enactivist reasons, is also valid, right? So the conclusion: this is not a no but reaction, right? It's not like, no, your proposal is wrong, but here's a better one. It's a different kind of intervention. It's a yes and, right? It's yes, the proposal of a distinction makes sense, and I think it can be useful in some contexts for some purposes. And there's more, right? It doesn't stop there. So different people will find different uses for the distinction. I think it's important to acknowledge, and I have a question mark, but I think this makes sense, that it applies to cognitivism too, right? That is, there are projects within cognitivism, if we can talk of a single thing, right? There are going to be projects that are utopian, philosophical. There are projects that are scientific, given the way Russell and Nick are using the terms, right? And other scientific paradigms too. We're going to find philosophical projects within a certain scientific discipline or research program, and there are scientific projects within them too. But setting that aside, right? Enactivists, I think, have reason to reject the categories, philosophical, scientific, also, and to do work that challenges them. So this is in a way a pointer for future work, right? On top of something that comes from the theoretical foundations. It's a pointer for future work, but also, as I try to show, it's also ongoing work, and it's work that's been going on from the start. So I went there. I just wanted to, I guess I'll share the link to this later, but I'm organizing a workshop online, co-organizing with Pedro Nogues from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, on perspectivism and realism in science and mind. So we're interested in thinking about this intersection of views about science, about mind, how they come together. They might be talking about the same thing in different ways, which I think it's in parallel, in continuity with what I'm talking about here about enactivism and thinking about enactivism from an enactive perspective. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, Guilherme, thank you so much. You made also some very interesting points. So moving on, I'll now invite Russell to make his reply. Russell, you're there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here and I can hear
Okay. Okay, Russell, you have about 10 minutes to make a reply or comments on Guilherme's view. And now, after that, we'll open the discussion to the audience. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, wonderful. So thanks, Guy. I'll start off. I want to clarify one thing. I think it's a paper that I think is maybe prone to a few misunderstandings at some points. I want to say that we don't distinguish between philosophical and scientific tasks as the utopian being like exclusively philosophical, the sole kind of heir to philosophy, and then scientific and activism is just all the science stuff. Both are going to involve philosophy. I think we would think it's strange to think otherwise, right? And the reason why we didn't call them, not just because of the title and that you get the Engels reference, but the utopian does not just mean philosophical, it means a specific task within philosophy. It's specifically this building of a defensible, overarching ontology. And then over on the other hand, we've got people who are doing both philosophical and scientific work, which we put under this banner we call scientific and activism. So we're not trying to I know that the demarcation stuff is a little different to what I'm saying here, but we're not trying to demarcate the scientific and the philosophical with these two projects. So that's just to start. But and I would say, we're not trying to establish that kind of dichotomy, but we also don't think that it really makes a lot of sense to, in fact, we think there's very good reasons to do the opposite of kind of melting or making fluid this distinction between science and philosophy. In the extreme case, I don't want a philosopher mixing up my batch of penicillin that I'm going to take, for instance. I want a different kind of knowledge and different kinds of standards to be going into that. That doesn't mean, necessarily that I have to put my stake somewhere and, oops. Hang on, am I still here?
Yeah, you're still here. We can hear you, and I can see you.
Okay, well. Good. I had a network disconnection. It's the travails of using a VPN in China into Google. We don't think that it makes a lot of sense. In fact, there's a lot of great reasons. I mean, we mentioned this in our commentary response. I'll give Nick credit for doing the bulk of the work here, arguing, that the fact that science is not some sort of objectively given thing, that it's not clear exactly where the demarcation lies, means there's even better reasons to push for rigor and for reliable standards more than to just say, well, hey, maybe, they're kind of interchangeable, maybe they overlap, they're sort of the same thing. I don't think there's great cases to be made for that. I certainly don't think that enactivism has given us such breakthrough successes or such immense confidence that we should accept that it's kind of busted down that distinction at all. So, and I know that, Guy, you're arguing as well that this is perhaps for people from the outside, it's useful to talk about enactivism in this way, but from the inside, maybe an activist should reject the distinction. I think, and maybe in our commentary response, we didn't really get into this as much. But hearing your talk and thinking about this a little more, I want to say that I think that enactivism sort of is already doing that. I think the point of our paper is that enactivism has been behaving in a way that honors reflexivity quite heavily, right? There's this sense that subjectivity and agency and so on are built into the phenomenon of life from the jump, and that we should be treating ourselves not as, computers or something, but as extensions of those kinds of basic notions, that we're living and minded in this sort of overlapping sense, and that we need to apply that kind of idea to our science as well. We have to understand that science is structured by the sorts of beings that we are. And my feeling is that enactivists already are really deep into those sorts of ideas. And I guess my feeling for enactivism is that, well, where has that gotten enactivism? Has that cracked the case wide open for enactivism? Has that allowed enactivism to really show what it can do, and make waves? And I think that it hasn't. I think that, for instance, you noted there are a lot of even recent papers still talking about these kinds of ideas, but I don't think that any of those are really advancing. I think those are discussions for enactivists. I don't think they're really advancing our knowledge of cognition that much. I think that they're furthering a philosophy of nature. I think they're doing utopian work, and that's fine. But I think down that path, if that's what enactivism takes as its goal, if it says, you know what, we're going to lean into this, we're not going to accept the distinction, we're going to lean into the idea that the utopian and the scientific are kind of indivisible or overlapping, I think that takes enactivism down the path of becoming sort of detached from worldly matters, becoming a critical stance, not really about our accumulation of knowledge about life and mind, but kind of an internal sort of philosophical language and discussion. And I think that that's fine. But I think that's also kind of a cul-de-sac as a future for enactivism. And I think what we wanted to advance was the idea that you can still just pick out useful bits from enactivism. Bits that are useful for scientific enterprise, and take them and start using them. We don't have to do all this. You don't have to have the whole enactivist suite of commitments. You can just kind of take the bits you like and run with it. And I think the consequences then are, well, what are the consequences? I mean, then you've got, I think every scientific package has got background assumptions, has got some, views it doesn't really know that it has lurking in the background. I think enactivism is the same as everybody else on that sort of front. Let me see, what else have I got here? So yeah, I think that the call to reflexivity is sort of already, that's kind of already in place. And we identify that as sort of the problem. that the push to apply enactivism's own views about cognition and so on is not really liberating for the whole research program. But if anything, leads to a kind of internal circularity and a curtailing of its potential, or the potential of particular principles of inaction for advancing our knowledge of cognition. So I think that it is really, it is useful. I think that it is useful for people inside enactivism to see where they can go rather than down that cul-de-sac. And if the cul-de-sac looks good to them, then I think, Guy, that you're right. Then this distinction is no use to them at all. But I think if you're in enactivism and you are thinking, I really want those explanations of cognition. I want cognitive capacities explained in enactive terms. I want to see the usefulness of it out there on the front lines. Then I think this distinction is useful for you. So I would agree that, as you say, depending on who you are and what you're trying to do, you're going to approach, for instance, this distinction in your own unique way. And I think that that's where it comes down to. I think some people might want to remain behind, and some people might want to look for new routes ahead. And that's what we would advocate. I think that that's 10 minutes already, so I'll leave it there.
All right. So thank you very much for both of you for this wonderful discussion. And now we're open to questions. If I don't know if Nick wants to say something, but otherwise we can start with. Let me see what the queue is here. Yeah, with Marco Aurelio is the first in line. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, I have a very short question to Russell. First, I really enjoyed the presentation and all the exchange between you two, Russell and Guilherme. Frankly, I don't know who is right. I think both are, and I go for yes and. But as a cognitivist, my question goes to Russell. I just wonder if exactly the same thing could be said about cognitivism, if there is an utopian and scientific dimension of it. And mainly because of since enactivism, since its beginning, appeared as a sort of revolution, or at least propagating some sort of revolution. I think the reaction from the more standard cognitivist standpoint was to react accordingly. So probably they developed equally an utopian and scientific sides. So I just wonder if the same thing can be said about cognitivism, because sometimes I feel like we have this monolithic cognitivism and we want to react to enactivists in general, and sometimes we just do science as usual, and sometimes we just got to pick things here and there. And I think all of us here, we will agree that we can pick things from both sides, right? From enactivism and cognitivism, and who cares, right? I think all you are saying is just abandon utopian and very radical approaches and do your science and pick up whatever is useful. So I just wonder if the same thing can be said about cognitivism, and if you are inclined to agree with what I have just said. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Marco. Yeah, I think so. I think we maybe have a footnote in the paper. I think we had a reviewer ask this question as well. And I think, yeah, there's if you look at what we call cognitivism, I think there's definitely a constellation of this ontology, and I think that itself comes out of you've got a whole mechanistic story percolating along for hundreds of years. You've got kind of the new metaphor of the computer. You've got as the new kind of machine. You've got all the language of thought. You've got all these really influential ideas that are part of this ontological firmament, and they don't really make contact with day-to-day science that much. I don't think if you you don't really see people really applying those ideas on the front lines. I think especially now, maybe more in the past, but I think especially, let's say in 2024, I mean, people are still debating this stuff, but yeah, I think that's really you can make this distinction in a lot of different frameworks. We haven't done that work, so who knows how that turns out, but certainly I think it's possible. I think someone could write that paper. Probably won't be me.
Just by the way, I think Guilherme will criticize as well, right?
Sorry?
I just think that the same criticism he presented to your paper, he will present to my cognitive distinction between utopian and scientific cognitivism.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one in line is Camilo. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, so hi. Thanks both Russell and Guilherme for really nice talks. And I really enjoyed both reading the papers and the talks. My question was similar to Marcos and to Guilherme's point, but I would like to make a different point. So wouldn't it be more useful to think about the distinction as a distinction about the objects of study instead of goals of study? For example, I'm thinking about the distinction between neurophilosophy and philosophy of neuroscience. So neurophilosophy studies the mind using neuroscience as a tool, and philosophy of neuroscience studies neurosciences. So the object of study is the neuroscience. So in the case of one distinction is that some philosophers, some enactivist philosophers are trying to answer what is the mind and what is life, and what is the relation between them. And some other enactivist philosophers are trying to do philosophy of science. So they are using and they are aiming at and they have as their object of study the cognitive sciences. So what do you think about this possibility of making the distinction not about their goals, but about their objects of study?
Yeah, I think that is, not quite the distinction that we're making, I suppose, in that I wouldn't say that scientific enactivism is necessarily, people doing philosophy of science, although it could be. It could be kind of embedded cognitive science. I think it's, certainly possible that you could have, talk about the goals and about the objects. I mean, I think they're interconnected discussions. They're not mutually exclusive. What I would say is, just to tee off slightly, is I think one of the problems in the broader enactive sort of discussion is that there's not enough philosophy of science. And I think there's a lot of philosophy of cognitive science, which sometimes forgets that it's kind of meant to be a branch of philosophy of science, right? And so you get these discussions going on, and you're like, guys, we've got the resources to handle this. We've got people on the case already. So, and you're nodding, so perhaps you agree, Camille, that we need a little more philosophy of science in the mixture, certainly.
Before I call the next people in line, and I saw that Nick and Guy have their hands up. If it's a follow-up to any one of these questions, okay. So I'm calling the next one in line, which is Andrea. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
So thanks for the talk and thanks for the response. Well, I would like to say Guy in the end was playing very diplomatic. So he was playing very yes, and so I was very much agreeing with the main point of the response, as I agree with the similar point made by Thomas van Essen, who was also in in the peer review commentary, and then Guy finished on a conciliatory note. But the point is, for me, whether we think that the distinction really is useful or is not. And my personal way of trying to make sense whether it was useful or not was to make a table of the references of what. So I was trying to. The question I was asking myself was, what the hell is scientific enactivism? And I was trying to make a table of what falls under which category. So this was the starting point of my analysis, which didn't really make it into the commentary, but I think it was useful for me to make sense of the distinction. And I had a longer list, but I think I have two examples that were also mentioned in the talk. So, for example, one case, so Oregon and Noe, 2001, that's probably falls under the category of scientific enactivism. It was published in a scientific journal. It's very much cited. And then Noe 2004, I don't remember the title of the book, was categorized as Utopian enactivism. Or the same thing, like Sensory Motor Life, Di Paolo and al. 2017, probably you would consider that as utopian enactivism, but then you have the paper you mentioned by Andrian and Egbert that came out last year, a couple of years ago, but there's also another paper with the same exact authors of the Sensory Motor Life. Burnham is the first author, and then you have Di Paolo and Barandarian, that was published in Frontiers in Psychology. You have a large part with modeling equations. So what I was asking myself, to put it a little bit in a joke, is either these people are affected by a strange case of schizophrenia, or the distinction might have to be rethought. And in the sense, so like the distinction seems to provide this idea of, on the one hand, you have this enactivism, which is philosophical and system building and has to be articulated rigorously, and another version which you can pick the ideas and apply them to science. But I mean, I think the only ones that really stand by the term enactivism are Hato and mine. But for example, Thompson and Di Paolo, they both say, well, we don't like the ism. We talk about the enactive approach. And of course, when you write a philosophy book, you're going to abide by the rules of philosophy books. So you're going to try to be coherent and make it defensible. And when you do applied stuff, you're going to try to model some ideas, etc. So the question is that, of course, I like the idea. I was a very, very big fan of the first paper, the idea, the putting down the revolt, because I like the idea of enactivism as a philosophy of nature. But the point is, how do we understand the scope and the aim and scope of philosophy of nature? And in this way, you think about philosophy of nature as like this abstract thing that doesn't have to do anything to do with science. And what I do agree with Guy is this idea that, well, it's much more. It's on a spectrum. It's something they touch each other in many cases. So aren't we attacking a straw man here?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, and thank you for the commentary, Andrea. I would say that we're quite careful in the paper to distinguish the works from the authors. So I don't see a problem. We don't talk. I think if you search the paper, you won't find the term like utopian enactivist or scientific enactivist, in the sense that we're not trying to say, Thompson, for instance, as this individual, he's a utopian or he's a scientific enactivist. I think that you can produce works that fit in both traditions. They're just different kinds of offerings. And I don't think that there's really too many complications with that kind of fact. I think that, in fact, motivates what we're doing here a little bit more, which is that people are talking about these two different projects as though they are the same thing, right? Building the philosophy of nature and doing the scientific work. And as you mentioned, like the idea of, well, you're doing kind of the coherent theoretical work and then you put it into practice. I think that's what people think they're doing. I just don't think that's what's actually happening. I don't think that you see necessarily the kind of development and escalation in enactivism of, right, the really coherent theory translates into the empirical work that then kind of tests that idea out. I mean, let's take autonomy. We haven't really seen that idea, which is so core to scaling up. I mean, I would reject this term, but expanding, let's say, enactivism to the full suite of, of cognition, from, up to human psychology or something. I just don't think you really see that kind of development that you would expect to see if that was what was going on. I think that there's confusion, and that these two projects, the building the really nice theoretical work, say in sensory motor life, and then doing the experiments, are not necessarily mutually informing one another. In fact, I think they're, as we suggest, they're kind of kneecapping. Utopian enactivism kind of kneecaps the scientific side quite often. And finally, I think you mentioned, yeah, again, I think, yes, science and philosophy, clearly there's overlap. I don't think that that's a reason to, I don't think that that gets us into, like, let's kind of give up on that distinction, or let's accept that that's like not something that we can hang our hat on here. And, maybe when I write a philosophy paper, isn't that kind of also sort of like science? And when I do a science, I don't really think that that's warranted.
Okay, thanks, Russell. Next one is Jody. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you both for the conversation, and the paper itself was so interesting to read, and it was really a pleasure to be able to write a commentary on it. So thank you for writing this paper so I could write a commentary on it. I wanted to ask you a question that's completely separate from anything that's kind of like been brought up in the issue itself, and maybe this is a bit of a step away from the debate about this distinction between utopian and scientific. But I was wondering if either you yourself, Russell, or Nick, had given any thought on the application of a similar kind of argument to the domain of predictive processing and predictive coding, because I feel like maybe there's an interesting discussion to have there that could either kind of like confirm or else kind of like maybe subtly muddy the waters as to like what we should be doing, or what we should be kind of like how we should be understanding cognitive science, in that predictive processing seems to have this kind of like this utopian aspect to it, this kind of like philosophy of nature. It can explain all of life using Bayes' theorem, which is mad to me, and it's also a reason why I think predictive processing is just fundamentally not cool, explaining all of life using a mathematical equation. But it's also incredibly popular. And one thing that I kind of like have been thinking about since I read your paper is how like there has been a problem of uptake in enactivism within mainstream cognitive science, and that there are areas where it does seem to have uptake, but it's not by no means kind of like pervasive. And I kind of noticed this more acutely myself when I gave a talk about the paper that you cited of mine, and it was to a room of philosophers of psychiatry who had never heard of enactivism before. And they were like, this is the first time we've ever heard this. This is the first time we're coming across this. And it made me really question, like, what the hell was the point in writing this paper if the thing that I'm criticizing nobody has ever heard of? But predictive processing, it has started to snowball a little bit more into the mainstream. So I was watching a talk by a Cambridge neuroscientist yesterday explaining the phenomenology of psychosis using active inference. And obviously, Carl Friston is a huge kind of like a home name now, right? So I wonder then, if predictive processing can do both, it can do utopian and scientific, why couldn't enactivism also do both? And if you've given any thought to applying your analysis to the predictive processing domain.
Oh boy. Thank you for the question, Jody. Predictive processing. I will say this. My impression of predictive processing when I encounter it is, yeah, it very much seems to be there is a, again, the predictive processing account of X, right? There's, like you say, there's a predictive processing account of everything under the sun involving life and mind. It's it's hot real, or it was, maybe, I don't know if it still is, but it was like really hot real estate. It was a great place to write stuff. You could get some citations. It was good. Speaking, as Guy was, about institutional incentives. I don't know enough about it to write that paper, and I probably will never know enough about it, if I'm honest. I would really have to dedicate some time to learning about something that I am sure there's like sober analyses out there that really have something to offer, like, that it's going to be like dynamical systems theory, or, anything that can offer us a really useful tool. Yeah, doing that, like, doing this, okay, it's really boring to look into. That was my impression. I didn't want to be that, I didn't want to go out there and say that. You seem to know more than me, Jody, so that's the official position now. It's too boring. But I mean, it comes up, like, it does, I think it comes up in actual, like, scientific discourse, so there's something going on there. Writing, like, this is kind of the end of the line for me in terms of enactivism, so it took, I felt like, castaway at the end. I was exhausted, I never wanted to read the word enactivism again. I was finished. But I invite someone else to do that, and I would love reading it.
Okay, so the next one in line is Carl. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you both. That was very helpful and very interesting. I also want to thank Guy for reminding us all that autopoiesis has its roots in second-order cybernetics. So thank you for that reminder. It's very helpful. So I'm going to ask, this is really for Russell, but anyone else might be invited to contribute as well. So Russell, I wanted to go back to this point you made at the beginning of your talk about the undetermination problem. Right. So
Right.
One theme that has come up in some philosophy of science in the past maybe 10, 15 years is the role of values in in theory choice and in hypothesis formation. Right. So Heather Douglas has written about this extensively. Matthew Brown and many others have talked about the role of values. And so I thought maybe this might, I was going to maybe ask if you think that this might be a place where philosophy of nature actually has a productive role to play in how we actually do science. Not necessarily on the belief side, which most people thought about determination, but rather in how we do in philosophy of nature. Philosophy of nature is also going to include, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly, an axiology. This is most explicit, I think, in Hans Jonas, right, who grounds an axiology in his philosophy of nature. And I think Jonas's influence in the Jonasian turn is on utopian activism is quite substantial. So maybe I'd like to ask you to sort of maybe invite you to maybe reflect a little bit on whether the right way or a productive way of thinking about how philosophy of nature is useful and important for science is not just in the how it addresses the role of values in the undetermination problem. Okay, so thank you. So let me know if you have any thoughts about that. I'd love to hear them.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Carl. I feel like Nick will probably have strong thoughts about this, but I can boot things off. Certainly, I think that a philosophy of nature, I think it exists sort of whether we recognize it or not, right? There's going to be one out there. It's just whether it's a well-argued and extensive one or not. So certainly, I think this, connects to ideas of, like, from feminist philosophy of science. I say would be my touchstone there. That, yeah, there's there's going to be invisible, very difficult to detect from within that particular set of beliefs, assumptions, background beliefs, and so on. So I think that a philosophy of nature, and I think that we have taken this position in the past, definitely can play a role in science. I don't really see right now a huge amount of evidence for that, or a huge, or such like importance or potential for driving kind of the scientific side of enactivism forward, such that, you know, I would prioritize it even more, because I think the philosophy of nature has been prioritized so heavily in activist literature. I think that well, I don't want to steal Conrad's thunder, but Conrad wrote another of the commentaries where he talked about how we never know where these philosophies of nature are going to go and when they're going to become useful again, when circumstances are going to be such, maybe in some, you know, Kuhnian sense, that suddenly that whole edifice of enactivism turns out to be like just what the doctor ordered. And I think I know, you know, I don't know better than anyone else whether that's going to be the case. That could totally be the case. Maybe 50 years from now, enactivism suddenly, like a lightning bolt, comes in and is decisive in cognitive science. And I think that a lot of the time, the enactive philosophy of nature is, you know, fascinating, but just ahead of we just don't have the means to test it out right now. It's beyond the science. I know that there's still struggles, like, you know, Tom Froese, you know, is working on enactive science, and it's like, it's really hard. So I think, yeah, there's an interesting balance to be had. Like in enactivism, I think the balance is so heavily, there's so much philosophy of nature, and it's given such priority, and it even kind of tries to determine the what's going on in the scientific side of things. And I think maybe rebalancing that a little bit would be a good idea, but maybe in future that all that effort that was put into the philosophy of nature might turn out to have been really important. Only time will tell. So I think those are my thoughts.
All right, so perhaps Konrad can fill in some of these gaps. So Konrad, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's great to be in such a wonderful company of enactivists, or those who criticize the movement. But anyway, you feel somehow engaged, let's say. So since you mentioned already my major point, Russell, the only thing I can do is to carry on with my own stuff. So so this is what I will do right now. So I think that the distinction is useful. However, and now what comes in is quite important. So I believe that, as I put it in my commentary, I believe that what enactivism brings to the table, so to speak, has a huge, and I really mean huge, philosophical potential when it comes to the most general way in which we categorize or conceptualize cognition, or the mind-world relation, or the subject-world relation, or whatever term we would like to use. However, as I put it in my commentary, this is a long-term project. So we as philosophers, if I can speak for myself, we should not expect short-term results in terms of, I will provide a new ontology of cognition today and tomorrow I will get a job at Harvard or something like that. This doesn't work that way. So what I would say is that this ontological enactivist project, but the problem is that enactivists don't like philosophy so much. I mean, ontology, metaphysics, epistemology, all this traditional stuff, they don't like it too much. And this is a problem, short-term problem, because they should learn more about it. But okay, it's a different thing. So when it comes to the fundamental thing, so the thing is that, as I put it in my commentary, this ontological change, if it happens at all, can build a new platform for empirical research, for science. If not today, if not tomorrow, then perhaps 100 years from now. And on this new platform, which is completely unintelligible for us right now, some new research projects can emerge. And however, and this is perhaps important, we should not expect being given any credit, in the sense that 100 years from now, somebody will say, oh, there was this movement of enactivists, utopian enactivists, and this is all because they did their job. No, nobody will remember that, most likely. But still, it is at least possible that on this new platform, something completely different will emerge. And the same happened actually a couple of 100 years ago with Descartes. He also built a new platform, and on this new platform, everything basically in modern philosophy and science, at least when it comes to the science of the mind, everything emerged. However, Descartes himself was not that much aware of that fact. And all the people who commented on his work were also not aware of the fact who they were dealing with, actually, and what they were dealing with. So, as I put it in my commentary, once again referring to that, we may not be fully aware of what will happen in the future. So this is one thing. Another thing is that philosophy should be patient. This doesn't mean that philosophers are patient, but philosophy as a discipline is a long-term project. Philosophy must be, so to speak, patient in building this platform. And don't be concerned too much with whether or not we will publish a nice paper or do this revolution tomorrow. We should not think in these terms. So this is another thing. And so, given all that, I would say that the distinction is useful between the utopian and the scientific, but it's useful today. It's useful for the sake of this discussion. And the fact that we're having this discussion is great. But my hope is that nobody will remember this discussion like 100 years from now. Just like nobody reads the commentaries to Descartes. Everybody reads meditations, but basically nobody reads the commentaries. And actually this should be our hope, that the distinction which is useful right now will not be useful in the future, and our discussion, which is great right now, will not be of any significance when this new platform is already there, assuming that there will be any platform. So I guess that my question after this way too long introduction is, would you accept such a condition? Namely that your distinction is useful, but it's useful today and tomorrow, but that it will be like this Wittgensteinian ladder, and if we are able to climb to a certain point by using this ladder, we will not use it anymore, and therefore the distinction would be obsolete, basically, because perhaps the very distinction between science and philosophy will be changed so much, that actually the discussion of whether or not enactivism is scientific or not scientific will be hardly intelligible. And this may happen. Actually, the distinction between philosophy and science meant something completely different for Leibniz or Descartes, for that matter. So perhaps it will mean something yet different in this future platform, so to speak. Basically, I believe that this is my comment. And just a quick question, whether you would accept such a condition. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I think I agree with everything that you say. I think and it is my hope, and I think me and Nick's hope. I mean that yes, this, if people were looking back on whatever becomes of this field, 50 years from now, whatever it is morphed into, we'll look back on this discussion or look back on our paper and think it basically unintelligible, or they don't really understand what use this distinction plays. Absolutely. What we hope really is as a goal here is that we want to do this clarificatory work such that we can tease out the ontological questions from the immediate, scientific questions of the right now, and sort of lessen the burden on everybody involved, and just disentangle the whole thing. I think as a consequence, that also kind of cuts at the knees the thing called enactivism, as another monolith. But everything that you say about where this is headed and where it might be useful, and I mean, Descartes and mechanism is always in my mind. That's my touchstone when I'm thinking about these examples. Who knows what societal factors, what institutional factors are going to come in, as they did in Descartes' time, and suddenly have this red hot burning desire for Descartes' philosophy, and which spawns, how much of modern philosophy and science. Absolutely. So where that goes, I'll be interested in seeing. But yeah, I can imagine enactivism as a stepping stone in a broader story. But I do think that will diverge a little bit. I think what's useful in enactivism for one group is going to diverge from the other for the time being, and they might come back together, in stranger times.
Okay, we're already a little bit over time, but we started a little bit late, so that's okay. But I just asked to keep this last questions short, so we don't keep Russell and Nick up until too late. So Guy, you're next.
Sure, thanks. I'll try to be quick because I want to hear from Nick too, as one of the authors of the paper. But I'll still ask my question. So, I feel like my intervention can come across as idealistic. I'm talking about like changing how we categorize things, the divisions between philosophy and science, and so on. And I get that. And so I see the appeal of the kind of more strategic thinking that's a way I would describe Russell, what, some of the ideas you presented in the response to my presentation. Right, there's a strategic perspective where you can think, well, how can I apply some insight from enactivism and do something with it in the front lines? I think that's the term you used, right? And you also talked about picking and choosing, right? You can you choose this concept, and maybe you don't have to take on the whole baggage and all that. Now, in conceding to the importance of being strategic, I worry that doing this might be counterproductive. And to make this point, I'll give an example from ecological psychology, right? The popularity of affordance is great, but it's terrible, right? Because everyone talks about affordances, but they're talking about something completely different from what Gibson and others in I don't know, mainstream is not mainstream, but the inner circle of ecological psychology, what an affordance is. And so there's a lot of experimental or theoretical work saying, I'm using affordance, but it's a different thing. It's just the same word, right? And so that's a worry that I see could apply to enactivism when you pick a concept or here or there and you apply, but without the rest, you're not actually talking about the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally know what you mean. Like, I think there's two ends of the spectrum. Like for affordances, right? You've got like people in user interface design who are like, oh, I use affordance theory all the time, and it's totally unconnected, or it's inspired, right? You can see the inspiration, but it's not really Gibson's notion. But then you've also got like, I don't want to start any duels here, but debates about like what's the ontological status of affordances and so on. It's like that really doesn't seem to be that important. Like, show me on the map where that changes what you do in an experiment, right? Would be my feeling. So I certainly think you make an excellent point. There's a risk of like, if someone takes the notion of autonomy, right? Which I mean already has many uses in many different fields, but the enactive notion of autonomy and corrupts it in some way. Well, I think that we should, as philosophers, smile upon such a development in that we get to write a paper about it. I think that seriously is a role for philosophers engaged with science, is to sometimes step in and say, like there's discussions going on right now about the nature of representations, and where we're kind of developing the idea that, hey, maybe representations are sort of broader than we thought they were. And maybe the corruption of representation from this strict Fodorian notion to a looser one is actually kind of what we all meant all along. Why did we really need to fight about that? But maybe the opposite could be true. Maybe affordances, we need to kind of wind that back at some point. Maybe the same will happen for autonomy. So yeah, I think there's a risk, but I think that's a solvable problem. I think we can solve that.
Sorry, can I jump in? Just a quick remark. So because you used the word corruption, and I wanted to clarify, I'm not worried about purity, right? I'm worried about, right? It's like sticking to the original ideas or something like that, but more that there's important insight that gets lost when you take something.
Sure.
Right? But I think with that caveat, I think everything applies, right? So, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I slip into the purity talk because that the radical enactivism literature is so obsessed with that concept. But yes, definitely.
Okay, Nick.
Sorry, I'll also keep this short, but thanks everyone for your engagement with the paper, and it's been really great listening to all of you have all these discussions. So my question is actually going to Guy and whoever else wants to pitch in. But so speaking on reflexivity, one of the things that we wanted to do in the paper, like overall, was invite a discussion, between people who are involved in enactivism or use enactivist ideas, and invite some self-reflection, amongst ourselves, amongst our community. Like, what is it that we're doing? Why are we doing it? And I think part of that, is also kind of, I love self-reflection. And so, because you brought up like university incentivization, I thought it's one aspect that may be important to think about is how enactivists work. Like enactive works have a tendency to sell themselves as like the underdogs, and we're doing this radical new cool thing that doesn't have all of the problems of big bad cognitivism. But even that sales pitch, right, is incentivized. There's, there are university reasons, career reasons that an activist work pitches itself in that certain way. There, incentivization, there's incentivization behind, the way that underdog stuff, and the way that, and kind of the wholesale, you need to take all of it or nothing, kind of also that, you can't piecemeal in activism. You need to buy into the whole thing and those kinds of arguments. So I think it's really important in, thinking about self-reflection to also think about the ways in which an activist work is incentivized in those same ways, and why we're pitching ourselves in those ways. So that was one thing. And then one more, and this goes back to what Carl brought up, is also, thinking about incentivization, to portray what enactivism offers in certain ways. And I think that there is this kind of maybe getting more explicit idea that enactive values are somehow better, or enactivism leans politically in better directions than some other things, or is more, compatible, let's say, with, marginalized, work, and it's not. And you can see that from like the philosophy of nature of enactivism. And activists have not made like a serious effort in building a philosophy of nature to integrate feminist philosophy of science, to integrate feminist epistemology, to integrate indigenous sciences, you know, and a number of other marginalized areas when we do have the opportunity to. Instead, we're replicating in some ways, you know, the same kind of, you know, objective, you know, stuff as like cognitivism light, you know, rather than taking the opportunity to, you know, assess our values from the ground up and make sure that we're building in, you know, marginalization and oppression, you know, from the get-go, right? So, so to Guy, I was wondering, you know, if that is something that you had thought, or any of those things were things that you thought about, you know, and the importance of self-reflection for enactivists as well. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I agree with everything you've said. I mean, and you know what, I think all of us encounter this, but you know, the pressures, the reason for writing something or other, right, and then the like influences on how you frame what you're presenting, right, depending on the journal, depending on the there are different conversations going on, right? And I think that's that's the one point I want to make in reaction to what you said, right? Thinking relationally, thinking about dialogue, right? I'm skeptical about ideas of theories in a vacuum, right? Our ideas are in dialogue with a context with other people, and there are different dialogues too. And so depending on which conversation you're trying to contribute to, you're going to have to frame your ideas in one way, which may not be the same for a different conversation, right? There are cases where, you know, if it's enactivism or ecological psychology, or you can't even get there, you have to say, no, it's for e-cognition, or right, and you need to put it against an adversary, or right. There are different contexts, different conversations. So I'm saying this again to emphasize the relational nature of our ideas, right? They are in relation to something else. They are in some context. So yeah, and those are the incentives, right? They do shape how we present ideas, and even I think the content of the ideas themselves, they aren't like floating separate from their embodied lives. So I think that's really important to think about, and in that sense I do appreciate your intervention, right? You're in Brussels, which is, well, there are projects that are targeting this or that context, right? And on some level, some grain of analysis, we can, you know, put a group of these interests or goals here. They're more philosophical or something, right? And other ones here, ontological, right? And other ones here, right? There's a way of thinking about the situation where I think that is useful, right? And it's important for self-reflection. I do acknowledge that, yeah. But I think it is important also not for an activist to not to think that that's the end of the story, right? Because at the same time, I agree with Conrad, right? That we don't know what the future will be like, and also the past is unrecognizable, right? Philosophy and science didn't exist. There were other practices, there were other discourses and questions that we're talking about, and so, right, it's just very specific to our point in time and place. That's one reaction, but I'd love to hear from other ones too.
All right, so I guess we'll bring this event to an end. So thanks again to Russell, Guy, Nick, and everyone who participated by discussion. We had such a wonderful discussion. Even if it turns out it's going to be completely useless in 100 years, it was still great to have the discussion with you here. So this is an ongoing series. The second session will probably be held in June, and we'll be discussing about some of the problems with enactivism as a framework for psychiatry with Jody Russell, who's here today. So you can follow our Twitter account. I just put it on the chat again, and you should have more news about that second event too. Okay, so I'll stop recording.